Well, it's great to be here, and thanks to Charlie and everyone for the opportunity. And I want to change tack very slightly, but follow on from what Jill was saying about the importance of grazers and browsers. So I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about the impact that they have on the landscape. And it's something I've been interested in for a long time. And here I am in a former life when I worked on the Scottish Natural Heritage Science Advisory Board, together with a few people you might recognise, Mike Usher, Paul Racy, and of course, Mick. And since I moved to the University of York, I've had what image consultants might call a brand refresh. But Mick looks exactly the same. So as I say, I'm interested in the influence of herbivores on plants and on landscapes. I've worked in a number of systems over the years, in Sinai Desert, in Malaysia and Borneo, and in Italy on wild boar. You'll see I've spent quite a lot of time sitting down on the job, and I only seem to have been able to afford one pair of boots and 2 shirts. But I have been interested in trying to understand how and why herbivores have the effect that they do on both plant communities and on individual plants, and in terms of both the chemical responses and morphological responses of herbivores, of plants to herbivores. And in the Italian project, we were in Maremma, and we asked the question, do plants respond to ungulate browsing? Ridiculously stupid question, because the answer is clearly yes. And this is me in mercifully a pair of lurid shorts you can't actually see, observing the effects of herbivores on the landscape. And one thing we noticed was that we looked at wild olive and cultivated olives, and we saw that there was a big difference, a big effect of fencing on the wild olives, not so much on the cultivated olives, because the cultivated olives were bigger and better able to withstand the impacts. And one thing that was interesting for me early on was I had a project based in Sinai looking at the impacts of, of the Bedouin grazing, which was a combination of sheep, goats and camels, on the vegetation in Sinai. And the Bedouin have become a lot more settled as the Egyptian government have tried to colonize Sinai, really, and also provide schooling for the Bedouin. And so their animals move around less. And so grazing in some of these wadis is extremely high. And when we put up a fence, we weren't sure how much effect it would have, because we thought water availability would be the big issue. But we still saw a big difference between ungrazed and grazed sites. Obviously, far more bare ground in grazed sites, and very dominated by unpalatable species. And the palatable species only really thrived when grazing was removed. So here's a sheep. You probably can't say, it looks like it's eating sand, which actually is probably more palatable than this plant here, which is alcana, but it's nibbling away at something, almost nothing left of a palatable plant. And this plant was so toxic that when one of the students touched it accidentally and rubbed his eyes, we spent the rest of the week bathing his eyes. So a lot of toxic plants survive. But I really want to focus on some key questions. So what do we want our landscapes to look like? And once we've decided that, which is a vexed issue in itself, of course, what grazing regimes can deliver that? So we can ask what type of herbivore we're going to have, how many of them, what mixtures we're going to have, as Jill mentioned a moment ago. And I've been particularly interested in how they decide what to eat. So here's a sheep completely overwhelmed by that question. There are a range of factors that we discovered quite early on. This is a slide from a project when I was working on red deer preferences, and we spent a lot of time, money and effort manipulating the chemical composition of trees to see what effect that had on preference. And it did have a bit of effect, but by far the biggest effect was the size of the tree. They had the same approach to foraging as I do, charge straight up to the front for the biggest portion and wolf it down. And there's interesting interactions between the quantity of forage and the quality of forage. For ruminants in particular, bite rate and how quickly you can take food in is very important. More of that in a moment. And I also wanted to focus on what effect herbivores had on the landscape. And most of the work I'm going to talk about is on the work I did in Scotland on the management of heather moorlands. So, to the aforementioned heather moorlands, what do we want them to look like? If you're a grouse shooter, this is fantastic. If you're a sheep farmer, this is fantastic. And of course, for most of the people in the room, neither of them are terribly fantastic. And we would actually want something that looked a bit more like that. So how are we going to get from either that or that to that? And what role can grazing play? So that was the question that I was looking at, although I have to confess right now, I didn't get as far as the trees. I'm mostly looking at the interaction between heather and grass. And that interaction is very much driven by grazing. So we're talking here about the competition between heather and generally unpalatable grasses such as Nardus stricta. You can see the impact of grazing when you put up a fence. Heather actually starts flowering, and you can see some very dramatic effects. And if you look long term, so this is the change in heather cover over a 30-year period at a number of different sites across Scotland, and you can see, if you plot that against the average stocking density, then at around 2 sheep a hectare, heather is stable. So you don't tend to lose heather cover below that stocking density. But of course, that's a very crude measure, and you can see from the way these dots are distributed all over the place that actually there's a lot of variation in that. So what I'm interested in as an ecologist is what explains that variation. Why in some sites does 2 sheep a hectare not reduce heather cover, but in other sites it does. So we're interested in the mechanisms by which heather cover is lost to grass. And we've heard a lot about light already in terms of forest canopy. I'm going to go down quite a lot lower and talk about the heather moorland canopy. And you can see that heather can produce an extremely dense canopy that shades everything else out. But when it's heavily grazed, you can see the canopy is very broken and open and able to be invaded. So one of the things that we did was measure the rate at which heather can close its canopy over time using this kind of 3-dimensional quadrat. And here's a student taking a very energetic approach to recording data. And this is just some data from the 4 sites, which I'll explain in just a moment. And the dark bars are fenced areas. And you can see that when you fence, unsurprisingly, the heather can start to occupy the canopy much more effectively, and you see an increase. But you can also see that that increase is much greater at site 2 than it is at site 4. And similarly, when you don't fence, you can see that the loss of canopy cover is much greater over here than it is over here. So we've got to ask ourselves what else is going on at these sites. Well, one obvious thing, of course, is the amount of grazing and by what. So these sites are all in, this is Braemar. So this is Glen Cluny and Glen Shee going south. So sites 1 and 2 are in Glen Cluny, which is a peaty and acid area, grazed largely by deer, and has average sort of shoot utilisations rates of about 45%. Whereas in Glen Shee, the grazing is largely by sheep, and the utilisation rates are much heavier, and crucially, the soil is much drier and much more nutrient-rich. So it isn't just the numbers and type of herbivores, there's something going on below ground as well. There always seem to be 3 herbivores in my pictures. So what are the mechanisms? So just to summarise about 2 decades of work, masses and masses of people's effort, if we look at how Nardus invades into heather canopy, that's promoted above ground by light availability, increased light availability. So the heather is no longer able to shade out competing grasses, and those competing grasses are unpalatable, so are not grazed, at least not to the extent that the heather is. Below ground, it's very much about nutrient availability and the structure of the soil. Heather's roots are much closer to the surface, the grass can penetrate deeper, and they also have different types of mycorrhiza, symbiotic fungus, that help with their nutrient uptake. So Ted's absolutely right, fungi are really helping to drive the system. So I want to move on to understanding a little bit more about how the herbivores home in on these grassy areas. And this was a project where we worked on deer foraging and looked at how they fed on grasses and the heather nearby. So we had a number of estates in Scotland, 6 of them, all anonymised because they didn't want their deer numbers revealed to the general populace. And I've just put 2 results up here. So one of these estates has 30 deer per kilometre squared on average, and around 12% of the land area is grass. And another estate had a much lower density and less grass. So this is looking at the utilisation on heather as you go away from the edge of this grass patch. So you can see that the utilisation on the heather as your shoots browsed is much greater very close to the grass edge. So what they do is they come onto the grass patch, they chomp away, they're a little bit lazy and they think, oh, I'll just have a few bites of this heather around the edge. So that's where the focus is in terms of the heather browsing. It's next to the grass patch edge. But you can of course see that deer density has an impact because when there are more deer, there's more browsing on the heather. The other thing that had an impact, and this is why we called the publication that came from this work, The Perils of Tasty Neighbours, because the grazing was much greater on the heather when the patch was a palatable species, Agrostis or Festuca, compared to Molinia or Nardus. And what is the consequence of that pressure? Well, this is the height of the heather as you go away from the grass edge for the building phase of the heather and mature canopy. And you can see that this intense grazing at the edge of the patch has caused the biggest drop in the height of the canopy. So the heather is actually at its lowest at the edge of the grass. And that's really serious because, of course, that's where it needs to be shading out the grass. So you can see you get into a kind of positive spiral where the deer come onto the patch, they eat the heather most around the edge of the patch, that reduces the canopy height around the edge, and the grasses can then not be overtopped by the heather and spread. So that's the kind of small-scale effects that are happening. What about at larger scale? So we, as part of this project, we looked at how the deer foraging was affected by much larger scale grass distributions. So we divided the landscape into pink and yellow, pink being heather and yellow being grass, and these are quarter-kilometre squares. And we had, so there's a central square and the 8 squares surrounding. And we classified the squares as low in grass in the centre square and low around, or high in the centre square and high around. And we had some lows and highs and lows as well. But basically the message here is that the mean utilisation rate on the edge of the grass patches is very much reflected by the landscape around those patches. So in this kind of landscape, when there's low density of grass in this large area, you see relatively low utilisation rates, but when the density of grass is higher, the deer are very quick to pick up on that, and they head straight for those patches and those landscapes. So they not only focus on particular patches, but they focus on grassy landscapes, and they can do that quite quickly. So how do herbivores make those kind of assessments? How are they able to select good forage, and how quickly can they learn how to do that? So we tried this experiment with sheep, which we thought would be quite selective herbivores. Generally, the smaller the herbivore, the more selective they have to be with their forage. So we had an experiment where we laid out squares along in the heather moorland, and each of those squares has been either fertilised or not. So the heather, there's a kind of mosaic of heather quality here, of high and low. And then we had a video camera at the top, so those of you suffering from insomnia, hours of sheep video, just what you need. I volunteered to shin up the tower and attach the camera and get it going, because I was a rock climber at the time. What I neglected to realise was that I'd assembled the tower upside down, so when I got to this last section, I discovered I couldn't actually fit my feet in properly. I was waving about in this gale, trying to cling onto this tower. And then we sat back and waited to see what the sheep chose to do. Now, we'd actually marked, for the ease of the camera, the posts. These mark out the areas of heather with margarine tub lids. We thought that would be easy for the camera to pick up, but you know exactly what's coming next. What did the sheep choose to eat when we let them into the arena? And erringly, they went straight for the margarine tub lids, at which point we thought maybe we were wasting our time trying to understand herbivore foraging behaviour. But in actual fact, once we removed the margarine tub lids and used white paint, they quickly became very accomplished at finding the fertilised patches. So in the first day, only about 60% of the time was on fertilised patches, but by the end of the week, 3/4 were, and they were actually fighting to get onto the fertilised patches. So they're very picky. Why are herbivores so picky? Well, they're right to be choosy, because grasses can bite back. And most of the last few years of my research, I've been working on a defense that grasses have against herbivores called silicon. They take up silicon from the soil in its soluble form, silicic acid, and deposited it in these crystals on the surface as these sort of razor blade type phytoliths, and in the spines. This is a scanning EM where the silicon is coloured yellow. This is the surface of Deschamptia cespitosa, so you can see why herbivores don't like that species very much. So silica is very abrasive. You can imagine trying to eat this as a herbivore. It really damages your teeth, and never mind what it does to the gut. So when we had another experiment with sheep, you see, I still persist with these herbivores. We had grasses that were grown on silica on high silica soils and low silica soils, and the white bars are plants that contain relatively low amounts of silica, and the black bars high amounts. And this is Agrostis, Brachypodium, Festuca, Lolium, and Poa. And you can see that the bite rate is much reduced on high silica plants because it's so abrasive, it's very hard for the herbivores to process that in their mouths. They don't like it very much, they bite more slowly, so their intake rate's reduced. And that has a bad effect on the rumen, and we know that silicon reduces rumen efficiency. But you'll also notice that the plants vary. So for Poa, silica has no real impact, and that is because Poa is much poorer at taking up silica and depositing it than some of the other species. Now, when we looked at the silicon concentration in around 20 different grasses and compared that to the abrasiveness that the silicon caused, we could see generally a positive relationship. We measured abrasiveness by seeing how quickly grasses could cut a groove into a perspex plate, and that was done using a machine that a colleague of mine at Manchester University has that measures the wear on women's clothing. So it is amazing where lateral thinking can get you, actually. So I would have never thought that women's clothing could be quite so important to my research. But anyway, so we could show that the abrasiveness was related to silicon content, but we could also see, if we took two grasses here, this is Festuca ovina, this is Festuca rubra, and you can see that they have actually quite similar silicon concentrations, very different abrasions. So there's something more going on there. I'll explain what that is in just a moment, but firstly, I just wanted, in the keeping of the conference, to think about the historical perspective. Now, grasses began to spread in the Miocene period, and that is the time that they started to take up silicon. And if you look at the way that herbivores changed over that time, this is an ancestral horse with its very low, small teeth, and this is a modern horse. Looks a lot more cheerful than this one. They're both dead, but anyway. And it's got much longer teeth. And one of the ideas is that as grasses became more and more abrasive because they took up silicon, herbivores responded by having much bigger teeth. So that's why mammoths and other grazers have really huge teeth, high-crown teeth, and other animals don't. So we can ask, are modern herbivores having the last laugh? Has this helped them overcome silicon defenses? Well, not entirely, because the plants have got another trick up their sleeve. So I'm just returning now to those species that I was telling you about a moment ago. This is Deschampsia cespitosa. You can see the silicon in these huge spines. This is Festuca rubra. The silicon is spread out all over the surface. And this is Festuca ovina. The silicon is in these kind of measle-like blobs. So the same amount of silicon here is much more abrasive and much more damaging to herbivores than the silicon here. So different plants have different strategies. Well, you might think, well, why does Festuca rubra do something so daft? Well, the reason is that this makes this plant much more resistant to pathogens because they can't penetrate the surface. What happens when you damage the grasses? Well, they don't just sit there, they actually take up more silicon. So this is Deschampsia after it's been damaged, masses of silicon all over the surface, many, many more spines, some of these horrible little knobbles. Festuca rubra doesn't do very much, just the same, but Festuca ovina, massive response, deposits silicon all over the surface and grows some more spines. So plants are very adaptive, so there's this arms race between the plants and the animals. So, just in the last few moments, I just wanted to mention, we very much focused on grazing as a management tool for our landscapes. But, of course, there are other ways to change biodiversity. And I just wanted to flag up Castle Hill, a national nature reserve not too far from here on the Sussex Downs. And downlands often managed, thank you for that contribution, by ponies to eat unpalatable grasses, but you can also use yellow rattle, Rhinanthus minor, which is a hemiparasite on grasses, and what that does is it reduces the grass cover. So here we had some experiments where we had some plots with no Rhinanthus, some plots where we removed it, some natural densities and some enhanced densities by adding seeds and increasing the densities. And you'll see that from absent to enhanced, we decrease the grass cover and we massively increase the invertebrates. And the reason is that Rhinanthus sort of removes the dominance of grasses, allows other plants to flourish. And that had a very positive effect on all sorts of organisms. Butterflies, weevils, snails, give them a mention, and lots of things. Poor old grasshoppers weren't too happy, of course, because their grasses had decreased. But generally, we had even effects on the detritivores. So one small plant can have a huge effect on the community. So very much a keystone species. So it's not just herbivores that can be keystone species. So I just wanted to conclude by saying we've got some key questions I think we need to think about. And it's been really great how we've been turning our attention to that in this conference and coming up with some good ideas. But I'm interested in how some herbivores have such an impact. What mechanisms are driving those impacts? How do we identify the right mix of species type and intensity of grazing to deliver our habitat requirements? Are there lessons we can learn from one system to another? How can we transfer best practice? And how do we really get to grips with things at the landscape scale? Often animals are foraging over a very large scale, and a lot of our experiments are done on really quite small scale. And how can we cope with the big effects of spatial and temporal heterogeneity? And of course, that's only going to increase as we face up to climate change. So I just thought I'd end with a few questions to get you thinking. As Ted said, we should be thinking about how we can manage our landscapes to best effect. So thank you to numerous funders, to hundreds of students and postdocs, and to you for listening. Thank you. Oh, sorry. I seem to be getting this completely wrong. Yeah, slow coming.
Yes. David Bullock, National Trust. A question for Jill about those low lateral branches on the maiden oaks. And the question is, how did they be allowed to happen and grow surrounded by large hungry herds of large herbivores?
Well, the limbs are above browsing height, generally speaking.
But they then come down.
Well, there could be scrub around them, of course, at that particular time, so they could actually reach down and touch the ground, and then they're away, as long as they've got branches above. Even when they're touching the ground, if some of the branches are out of reach of the browsing animals, then they'll survive perfectly all right in that situation. Yeah, they gradually come down, but they've got branches which are higher than out of the browse level, so they can still be feeding that particular limb.
I'm very interested in everything that's been said, but we really haven't touched very much on how animals used to migrate. They used to migrate, there's no doubt of that. I suppose we've got a few of the deer on the hill coming off, but where are the migrations? Where are we allowed to see animals actually move in drought times, in weather, cold weather and that sort of thing? One of the things I would love to hear is how the people with the reindeer, the herders, they're sort of, I suppose, they're Northern Hemisphere people as opposed to the people down in the the African areas. But we don't really now have very much experience, except perhaps in Romania and Spain with the transhumance things. So it would be lovely if we ever have this conference again to get somebody to talk about the movement of animals, how man actually moved with his animals and watched them. He probably followed them, not he took them. I think that's one of the significant things, and you've touched upon it there, yeah. I think.
It's one of the things that's changing in Sinai, that they don't move them now like they used to.
Yeah, but it was that the man followed the animals.
I'd be interested, though, Ted, in wild boar that we have today, which are not contained, whether we are actually tracking them and seeing what they're doing. And we do have deer populations which are, what are our red deer doing in these landscapes? We're not really necessarily following what they're doing. So are they migrating over great distances? True.
John Lister Kay, Agus Field Centre, Highlands of Scotland. First of all, I'd like to say, Sue, I'm really sorry that I didn't overlap with you on the SNH board, because I think those boring board meetings must have been much more fun when you were on it. Secondly, I can't help asking a slightly facetious question. Did your return to England, was it anything to do with the fact that the overpopulation of deer and the endless debate in the Highlands about whether or not deer numbers should be reduced, was that a factor in you abandoning the north where you were doing such wonderful work?
Well, no, it wasn't, but I do appreciate, thank you very much for your sentiments. I think there was, well, there still is, I suspect, a huge debate about what is the right number of red deer, and that was one of the reasons that it took us quite a long time to get that estate scale project underway. The estates were extremely nervous about letting us count, the deer and their impacts and so on. So I think it is a very controversial area and one where I think it's really important that we try and get the right evidence to guide our decisions. And I know Bill's going to be talking about that tomorrow amongst a number of other people. But no, the reason I moved from Aberdeen to Eastbourne, to the south coast, and because I could say it was for a fantastic job opportunity at the University of Sussex, but it was actually for better weather. No.
Very interested in the landscape thing about the short heather near the better soils, because I've been looking at the same thing in New Forest, but I get the impression it's a bad thing to have short heather, is it? Because it's a very good thing where we are.
That's very interesting. I mean, I think it's like a lot of these things, what is good or bad? It really depends what you're trying to achieve. So if you're, the systems where I was working on the heather moorland, you were in northeast Scotland, you were trying to achieve, obviously, a kind of mix of heather heights in terms of the grouse. They needed some short stuff and some long stuff. But in terms of preventing the spread of unpalatable grasses, the way to do that is to shade them out. Whereas if that isn't a problem in your landscape, if you're more interested in having open areas for you know, for reptiles, for example, then shorter heather would be better. And of course, the thing about a tall heather canopy, it's absolutely crap for plant diversity. So
The difference there is that it's very ancient pre-glacial soils, and there's no nutrients in them. There's no grasses.
yeah,
Graze
exactly.
it short, and you just get bare ground and lichens.
Yeah. So as we
And
said,
woodlarks.
yeah, as we've said, it's very, very contingent on other environmental factors, the impact that grazers have, or the impact of plant competition. And certainly we found that the huge difference between Glenshee and Glenclooney wasn't so much related to the different grazing densities, or that was important, it was very much the different soil types. You had so much worse impact on heather when the nutrient levels were higher and it wasn't peaty soil. Thank you both very much. Sorry.